Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. If there are any difficulties with the audio, if you just want to let me or the chamber team know, sort of if all else fails, just wave frantically, although that's probably not going to work unless you've got your video on particularly well. But thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. And thanks to the chamber team for organising the event. My name's Andy Brunt. I'm a director at Effciency, and I'm here today with my co-director, John Pickup. John will be delivering the vastly more interesting parts of the presentation as usual. Just by way of background, I've been active in sustainability for 20 odd years in a number of different contexts and roles. My sort of ultimate academic background is environmental science, and my particular interest or niche has been sustainable buildings and sustainable energy. So I'm conscious to a degree that we've all got other priorities right now. We've obviously got the ongoing COVID situation on top of the usual stresses and demands of our day jobs. And we're perhaps at different levels in terms of experience with regard to energy and buildings across whoever's online today. But if we're able to achieve one take-home message from this presentation, I'm hoping to convince you that we all need to take the energy performance of our buildings very seriously, and perhaps more seriously than has been the historic norm. And I think the sort of carrot to that stick, if you like, is that if we do so, there are some genuine opportunities to have really positive impacts and synergies with what we're trying to achieve in the other aspects of our business activities. So it's a good fit for overall business strategies to sort of get this bit right. It's going to be a slightly whistle-stop tour of some of the issues, but hopefully we can pick up on any specific queries that you might have at the end of the session. Okay, next slide, please, Chris. So from an ecological perspective, there's obviously considerable urgency, I think, in bringing about some proper concerted action to address a range of really interconnected issues, from climate change to habitat loss and overconsumption of a range of resources, really. And as we've heard a couple of times recently from different people, if you liked coronavirus, you're really going to love climate change, because it presents, even more significant systemic challenges to the way things are at the moment. So I think from the perspective of companies across all sectors, the impacts are also going to be felt in terms of increasingly challenging environmental legislation, although obviously much depends on the government of the day in that respect. But there's also stakeholder pressure from various directions to be responsible and sustainable. And you've obviously got the ultimate bottom line hit of increasing energy costs. They may have had a slight wobble in the context of unexpected demand reduction during COVID, but if you look at the history and the trajectory over time, there's a fairly clear message there, and that's only going one way, and energy is going to increase in price. Next slide again, please, Chris. So at Edge, what we try and do is to take the view that whilst there are some common principles, every building really is different, every business is different. So it's important that we understand our clients' circumstances and objectives so as best to be able to plan an effective energy improvement program. It makes a huge difference, for example, if the buildings are owned or leased by the company, how long the client intends to be at their current location. If you don't own the buildings, it can make less sense to invest in fabric upgrades unless you have the landlord on side and contributing to the cost, because he understands the longer term objectives and values. Also like to think that we take the starting point as understanding what our clients have already and whether there are really good opportunities to improve it. The answer isn't always expensive new kit. It might be to simply improve the operation and control of the systems that you already have. So we do try and understand those aspects before we start suggesting wholesale changes and the like. Okay, next slide again, please, Chris. So obviously, the extent to which your building insulation is doing its job properly is only one aspect of the wider issue of energy management. So this slide just sets out a simplistic overview of the key components of wider energy management. Hopefully the message here is that it isn't rocket science. The key components are simply common sense, really. You can see them on the screen there, and it's in all organisations' interests to proactively manage energy, reduce expenditure and improve carbon emissions on the back of that. Okay, I'm going to hand over the baton to John, who's going to look at some further technical aspects of buildings and insulation.
Yeah, next slide, please, Chris. Thank you very much. I shouldn't be saying this as an architect, but buildings are simple. And fabric improvements don't necessarily fall into the large capital cost sort of investment envelope. It can be planned maintenance and general maintenance, just making sure that the things that are being done are the right and they can be phased over a period of time, so they're not influencing adversely.
Sorry to butt in, John. You're just a little bit quiet on my end. Is there any way of just increasing the volume?
My volume? How's that?
That's better. Yeah.
We tend to focus on our houses in terms of energy costs, whereas business costs in terms of energy tend to be wrapped up in overall costs. And I think those need to be extracted so we know where the use is. And we need to target areas where the heat is going. And the first and foremost is to stop air leakage from a building. If you want to reduce your energy costs, then air leakage is the start. And not just from the inside to the outside of the building, but green spaces within the building. I think that's fairly critical. So you're looking at the use of the building and the layout, not just the overall expenditure. Thank you, Chris. Heat loss in buildings. Check for leaks from the top down. Heat rises very simply. So the graph in front of you obviously shows the significance of air leakage, and then obviously from roofs and skylights, and then obviously from different components. Thank you, Chris. Our hierarchy really is to do the simple things first. Go for the low-hanging fruit, understanding your building better, and target improvements so that you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck for that level of investment. Obviously, you can improve the heating system, but I think going through the assessment of what you have and maintenance and condition and looking at your energy use in certain areas should be a precursor really before you start looking at sort of installing renewable technologies. Thank you, Chris. Andy, I think over to you for legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, John. So a question that we are often asked is, concerns what the minimum planning authority requirements are for building energy efficiency. And the answer is almost always that it depends. Some authorities don't specify any specific requirements of their own, and obviously therefore the minimum would be the building regulations and specifically Part L, which deals with the conservation of heat and power in buildings. And I think, as we probably all know, this has been incrementally tightened over the years, and another review is imminent. I think the original intention was for a new version of Part L with revised sort of improved standards to sort of further pursue the national net zero emissions target was originally going to be last year, but obviously that was scuppered to a degree, I think, by the pandemic. So I think the latest expectation is that Part L will be released in October or the back end of this year, and is likely to come into effect from April next year, although that's still to be confirmed. There were two versions of the revised Part L as part of the consultation exercise that the government ran, and they obviously had different requirements, but the signs at the moment are the government's poised to go for the tougher option, which is basically going to require a 30% improvement in overall carbon emissions compared with current standards. Now, this is going to be a huge leap, especially given that the most readily achievable measures have already been implemented. And it's really going to require far-reaching changes. You know, we're already starting to hear conversations about the phasing out of gas as a fuel in buildings and increasing use of heat pumps, for example. But it's also going to have big implications for fabric improvements and enhanced air tightness. Okay, back to you, John, for next one.
Thank you. Yeah, just want to pick up on a couple of case studies, a bit of experience, hopefully will be of value in terms of a strategy for businesses looking at improving the insulation of the buildings. The building on the left-hand side, industrial building in Burnley. One of the key things that we looked at there was ergonomics. So certain parts of that building were offices, obviously were occupied by staff all the time. Certain parts of that were warehousing with big roller shutter doors and goods in and out, etc. So there seems little point in increasing insulation levels throughout the whole of the building. It's about the use and targeting the insulation. So in that instance, the offices were a mezzanine level within the main operational space. So we looked at insulating around the offices, the floor and the roof and the walls. So that became a semi-autonomous element of the building. It reduced the cost of upgrade, but improved the working conditions considerably. And the other thing we did was certify insulated fast roller shutter doors. And obviously, if you've got a big warehouse with doors outside, it's about your volume of heat loss from the building. So if you can put those doors in different fibers so they're not open at the same time, that can be extremely beneficial in volume of air that you might otherwise lose. Building on the right-hand side is a church we're working with at the moment. We identified certain areas that need improving through thermal imaging, thermographic imaging, which is a very good non-invasive way of establishing where heat is being lost through the building fabric before then you go on to restrict that and to improve insulation. And there may, as in this instance, there may be planning restrictions, particularly in terms of external cladding. So, you know, being aware of local authority approvals for any work that you're doing is also key. And then in this instance, we looked at lobbies and airlocks to reduce drafts into the main occupied spaces. So again, it's the ergonomics of the space and how the air flows around the building. So stopping that, certainly if you tackle that with appropriate ventilation, that can be a very cost-effective way of approaching improvements in insulation. Next slide, please. One on the left-hand side, air tightness, as I say, I think is really key. Just an instance here in terms of, it was a stick build building, which was timber frame, and it went for rigid slab insulation. The problem was that the 8-foot long pieces of timber used in the studding warp over time, and trying to get a rigid board in there proved very, very difficult. And there was a lot of time spent sealing the edges of the board. So the bits in between are more important in terms of making sure that the insulation, you know, the R value of the insulation is maintained at its optimum. On the right-hand side, insulation in general can be applied inside or outside of the building. It depends on thermal performance, or as I say, the R value, and the quality of the install as well, and who's installing. So whether that's a general building contractor, or, you know, in certain instances, we would certainly recommend specialist companies, particularly if guarantees are required at the end of the day. Types of insulation, there are various: mineral fiber, blankets and rolls, which we're all familiar with in our lofts at home. They're loose laid, flexible, relatively inexpensive, but they have to be put into spaces efficiently. Rigid boards, we've talked about that, maybe polystyrene. That really requires an expert install, because that's about the quality of the seals around each board. Then there's loose fill, cellulose, fiberglass. Again, specialist installer has to be used, because the insulation needs to be contained if it's going into a cavity. There's a sprayed option as well, which we've come across before. Not entirely convinced about it, because it's all down to the quality of the install and there's a number of mortgage companies wouldn't guarantee overspraying of certain areas of buildings as well. And then there's a replacement system, which is if you're replacing a roof or profiled metal cladding, go for a highly insulated, above building regs as much as you possibly can, replacement sheet. And the first example there, the factory, that we specified a new insulated profiled sheet roofing material that had an awful lot of roof lights in it, which reduced the reliance on the electric lighting internally. So there was a double benefit in that. So your main considerations, I think, for applying insulation is access, location. The specification of the insulation is absolutely key. The disruption that it's likely to cause, because you're working at high levels, scaffolding, health and safety, access is fundamental to that. So getting the specification right. Fire safety, we live in a post-Grenfell world at the moment, so we need to make sure that the surface spread of flame is taken into account. And again, that all comes down to a full specification, and I would certainly recommend that approach. Avoiding cavity bridging or cold spots, dew points, the natural moisture content in warm air will condense at some point throughout within the building fabric, within the walls and the roof. And putting insulation on the outside, the inside will change that dew point. And what we want to avoid is that having a detrimental effect to the building fabric. I've mentioned finance and mortgages. As I say, some techniques are not really supported by the banks because of on-sale value of property. And quite in a number of cases, guarantees are required, and therefore specialist installer is fairly key. Next slide, please, Chris. So it's an iterative process. Measure what you have and where it's going. Consider something like thermal imaging survey. That's a non-disruptive way of finding out and understanding how your building operates. Get the right specification. Target specific areas, so it's not just about the whole building necessarily. Consider the disruption that it might cause doing the job and factor that in by the maintenance or a phased introduction of insulation. And remember, I think Andy's alluded to, environmental improvements are a point in time. We're constantly continually monitoring against building energy use and operation, and the materials and techniques are improving all the time. So what you do this year might be slightly different next year, and keeping abreast of those improvements in technology can certainly help in terms of the long-term plan for the enhanced environmental efficiency of your particular building. Thank you. Andy, I think you're on the next slide.
Thanks, John. Yeah, next slide, please, Chris. Yeah, I think just by way of wrapping up, really, I mean, hopefully, John's got into some of the technical details there. But I think, what we would say in summary is that there is no single, easy, widely applicable solution to improving a building's energy performance. The key really is to undertake a detailed assessment of your assets, to understand which elements currently perform well, and those which may need attention, I think, as a starting point. So once you've got that, you can then prioritize, potential actions in terms of costs, savings, and taking into account practical considerations such as, the impacts on your ongoing business operations, getting work out of the door, and also your wider organizational goals, really. Next slide, please, Chris. So just a quick 30 seconds on Edge, who we are. We started Edge specifically to cover energy from an integrated perspective, so design, environmental performance, and engineering solutions. Our approach is based squarely on the interface between these disciplines. We have a director, John, who obviously is an architect and a sustainable building design expert, myself on environmental, and our colleague Will, who's a heating and renewables specialist. So obviously that's a good combination in terms of being able to provide this kind of comprehensive approach, and we work with clients really to ensure that both the buildings and their operations are as efficient as possible. So we do this by providing a range of services, from an initial assessment of energy performance, what you've got now, what works, what doesn't, to producing and implementing detailed improvement strategies. We work with clients to develop a strategic and comprehensive approach where all aspects of building energy performance are integrated into a coherent package with one objective, which is really to save our clients money and energy, which obviously has the concurrent benefit of reducing emissions. So whether you're a two-man enterprise working out of a rented unit, or a multinational company operating from dozens of sites in different countries and continents, there's always something we can do for our clients. And as I say, we treat each client as an individual. I think we recognise that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't the most effective method, and that all organisations have unique characteristics and issues which need to be taken fully into account. We're genuinely independent. We've got no ties to specific manufacturers or technologies, so the solutions we offer are only ever the ones which are best for the client. Okay, well, that's me done. So thanks for listening to myself and John today. I'll hand you back over to Chamber, and then if there's any questions, I'm happy to take those.